So you all have met Mike earlier. I want to introduce Rachel Bratt. I'm not sure that she needs an introduction, but Rachel Bratt is Professor Emeritus of Tufts University. She's been writing, researching, and advocating for housing for some time. We'll just leave it at that. Rachel, I think of her as, importantly, the editor of a volume called A Right to Housing, New Foundations for a New Social Order, that she did. Something like that. I'm getting old, I can't. But she edited that with Chester Hartman and Michael Stone, a very important book. And her own book, Rebuilding a Low-Income Housing Policy, which was from 1989, and in many respects kind of echoes the conversation we're having today. So I want to start off by asking Rachel, who has been looking at this, thinking about this for a long time, did we talk about anything new here today, or is this just all old wine and new bottles? And there's a microphone there for you, Rachel.
Is that on?
Yep.
Yeah. So first, let me just thank Chris and the Joint Center for Housing Studies for organizing this and for focusing on an issue that I've cared about, as Chris says, for quite a few years, about 5 decades, more or less. I think Louise Elving just added the context that I wanted to start with, which is I care enormously about housing, affordable housing, and particularly social housing, housing owned by nonprofit organizations and public housing authorities. But in this current context that we're living in, it's really, really hard to have this conversation because of what's going on outside these walls, even just down the street, even at Harvard. And I just wanted to say as a starting point that I'm distracted by the world events, and it's hard for me to, even though I've been paying attention because I knew I had to do this at the end of the day. It's hard for all of us, I think, to focus on these issues, but I think the panels all did a remarkable job of doing that to the best of their ability. So I want to thank Chris and everybody for focusing on that. I also want to point out, I see Chris's questions here for us. It's a very neat typed page. Let me show you my notes. My notes look kind of like this. Trying to scribble out things that I wanted to say and share with you, and not having been teaching at Tufts for a decade now, anytime somebody hands me a microphone, I'm kind of a bit incorrigible and just want to talk. I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you a chance. That's.
I already got a chance.
Wait, isn't that my job as moderator?
Yeah. So what did I learn? First of all, I learned that there is still so much passion for this topic. And I love the passion, and I love hearing it. It rejuvenates the soul when I hear particularly young people. I mean, there are a number of people from my generation here, and we've been talking these talks for decades, but hearing some young people up here was really inspirational and made me feel like there will be an after point when these ideas will be front and center again. I'm confident of that. So I learned again that there's passion and that there's hope. I also feel like, for me, the definition of social housing harkens back to a word, decommodification. It's been mentioned a few times today. I first encountered that word in 1983 in an article by Emily Ottenberg, who's still around, and Peter Marcuse, who wrote maybe the first article about decommodification of housing in this country. Whether we're talking about decommodification or social housing, for me, the bottom line is it's permanently affordable. And that is what Michael from the Champlain Housing Trust said. That has got to be, for me, the absolute bottom line. It has got to be permanently affordable. It has got to be taken out of the private speculative market and made available to current and future generations, period, full stop. I love the other things that often go along with social housing. I love the items that Chris pointed out. It is often related to resident input a control. It's often related to green energy. It's often related to community development. It's often related to hopefully resident services. But it's got to have long-term permanent affordability. So I could continue with some of the other things, but I think I should stop and give Mike a chance because I'm a team player.
And so for Mike, so the kind of the conceit for this panel is we have Rachel, who's been doing this for a long time, and Mike's a relative newcomer who's got passion, who's leading the charge of the state. So Mike, kind of with fresh eyes, having experienced the conversation today, you've been thinking a lot about this, but anything stand out for you as new thoughts for you as you think about your social housing pilot for Massachusetts?
Well, thank you, Chris. I mean, first, echoing Rachel, I think this whole day has just been very hopeful as someone who's been pushing the rock forward on Beacon Hill and trying to bring people together. We do see a lot of passion. We see a lot of hope. Going back to what Crystal Cornegay said, we do have institutions that have been founded with social housing in their mission, with mixed income development in their mission. We've also seen new developments like the Momentum Fund that are creating new financial tools. So I'm incredibly hopeful, and I just think we have to continue having this conversation. Another thing I'll say is, somebody mentioned earlier, nobody mentions revenue or nobody mentions taxes. We need a lot more revenue. I think the appeal of social housing and the appeal of the revolving loan fund is that it's a way that we can deploy our scarce resources, more effectively, but then we also have to grow the resources. We as progressives engaged in a 10-year campaign to pass the Fair Share Amendment. Thank goodness for that, because that's what's providing free school meals, that's what's allowing us to improve the MBTA. We also have to think about broad ways of raising new revenue for housing. And when we do that, we can support existing programs and we can create new programs like the social housing models that we're trying to bring forward.
And so along those lines, Mike, ideas for those new sources of revenues? I know you, as a legislature, I'm sure you got plenty.
Yeah, I represent Cambridge and Somerville, so all day long I'll say, let's tax big corporations, let's tax the very wealthy. Thank you. Yeah, when Trump was first in office, they cut the top corporate tax rate from 35% down to 21%. Most recently, the legislature passed a $1 billion annual tax cut. I happened to vote no against it because there were parts of it that I felt were too generous to the very wealthy and to big corporations. And, I think the potential to use bonding capacity, to use revolving funds, means that if we can just raise an additional $500 million a year, an additional $1 billion a year, that can really open up our capacity to issue more bonds and then use that revenue stream to service the bonds and actually make a real dent in this ongoing emergency.
Rachel, did you have something? You look like you had something else to add there.
I have a lot to add. I think what you're doing is just amazing, and what came up particularly the last panel was the whole financing issue, and that we haven't figured out at all how to deal with the capital finance of building the housing and the operating subsidy needs. And this has been mentioned a few times. We don't have that magic sauce or secret sauce for doing that. We cannot really make inroads on social housing or on any kind of affordable housing without those two key components. I was heartened to hear about, this is something I learned, what you've done, Tanya, with your group in raising $8 million of private equity. I did not know about that. So that is, I think, a new idea. That is really a new input to this whole conversation, is how do you leverage private market capital to try to reach the goals that we're talking about. I think other things that came up in conversations was, how do you put new spins on old issues? Code enforcement was mentioned, I think, in Lewiston, was code enforcement. Connecticut. That's a phrase that comes back to me from the 1960s. The Model Cities program talked a great deal about code enforcement. How do you slap codes on landlords and require them to fix up their homes? So here we've got a new version of code enforcement, an old bottle of wine with a new, what did you say? That was very cruel.
Old wine and new bottles.
There you go. Old wine and new bottles. And that is a new bottle. I think we can try to figure out what are the regulations that we can now put into place of code enforcement that would put real teeth into it so that the residents would then really have an opportunity to get a hold of those buildings. I'm looking over at the housing authority people and feeling like, boy, you guys have been doing the Lord's work for decades. And I've been such a supporter of public housing in my own work, always feeling like public housing has gotten such a bad rap. A lot of stigma, but it was the design, it was the management, it was pointed out. When I was teaching at Tufts, this is just a quick parenthetical item, as it will all be quick and parenthetical. I used to have slides that I would show my students that one set of slides was Tufts University dorms, and the other slide was public housing in Somerville. And I would ask them, what's what? Is this public housing or is it a dorm? And finally they would say, oh, that's my dorm. I recognize that building, but it looked just like public housing. It was just public housing. It was built in that era. It all looked brick and whatever, but it got to be stigmatized because it was brick and high-rise and then ultimately poorly managed because it didn't have enough operating subsidy. Again, that magic operating subsidy really messed up public housing and the image of public housing.
I just want to pick up on one thing you said about the financing part. And we had a dinner last night. It was a really interesting dinner with a lot of the speakers from today. And Crystal Cornegay was talking about financing and the lifeblood of financing. And I think in some level, there's a lot about residents and communities and how do we build communities, but it comes down to money. And I think the conversation of the last panel, I think, was a little bit, brain exploding and thinking about the things that Craig is wrestling with and how do I make this fit within this? And then Tanya's talking about the investor reports that she has to prepare. And what we really need is flexible capital that's affordable. And in some ways, if we had like a big development bank that was able to pool risks and provide flexible capital to allow a lot of these different things to bloom, we would be getting a long way towards a new system. Now, it's really common, I think, for folks who want to do well and think this is great is to forget about the fact that this is risky. And Crystal, who last night she was talking about, so when I make you a loan, people say thank you. She says, I'm getting that money back. And so when you make a loan in the public sector, you do have to make sure that money comes back, because otherwise you're going to find out that you ain't able to make any more loans, right? So I don't think we want to be too cockeyed optimist about this, but I think this question, one of the things I've just been thinking about a lot between the conversation at last panel and last night is how do we think about a finance system that brings capital where we need it at a cost that's needed without undue risk? Sounds simple, but Crystal's going to take a fellowship and figure this out, right? That's right. So we're going to work on that.
If you had public finance that didn't expect a return, then maybe that would be okay too.
Well, yeah.
I'm up for that. I mean, public housing, the original public housing formula was basically a grant over 40 years, right? The annual contract.
And
it worked.
And I do think the revolving loan funds are essentially that, right? They're bringing public debt in and they're getting the payback, and that means you can put that money back to work. So I just want to I'm kind of taking over the microphone here as like moderator turned panelist. I guess it's my prerogative. It's my show, right?
It is your show.
I'm going to put this like in a statement in the form of a question. It's like, what do you think of this idea? I mean, one of the things that struck me too, I think a lot of the conversation about social housing we've been having overemphasizes new housing, and it's about new development and focusing new development. I think a lot of the conversation today about existing housing has to be more of the emphasis as well. And I think, Rock USA, Mary O'Hara, it's like flying under the radar. Like, so we have essentially one of the most successful TOPAs in the country, right? Which is all these states that have this, opportunity to purchase as a manufactured home community is super powerful. And so you look at what Rock USA has accomplished, and you think about, like, why can't we do that for rental housing? And there's some ways of what's that?
We're trying.
Well, keep at it. I mean, I know there's a lot of people here trying, but I hear you, brother. I hear you and I applaud you, brother. But I'm saying in the social housing movement, we don't talk about that enough as a key element.
Well, I think one of the things that I thought was particularly important was, I think it was Michael who mentioned how opportunistic you are. And I loved that image, that we have got to be opportunistic. Old hotels, motels that you were able to get your hands on, you grabbed them. When I loved the question about design, what's your design for your renovated hotels? Well, you know, we're at a design school, and that might not fly. You know, if you're getting a critical, you know, as they do in design school, you get a lot of critiques, right? That might not have flown, but it provided a one-bedroom apartment to a family that had nothing. So I think the idea of being opportunistic in every possible way is what we've got to be looking on. The opportunity to purchase homes. I loved hearing about Rock. That was something new. I did not know anything about your work, Mary, about Rock and the implications, as Matt is saying, for tenant ownership and tenant conversions. So let me stop there.
I do want to be mindful of time and the fact that we have a reception waiting for us. So I guess maybe to kind of get towards, one last question for you, Rachel, and Mike, you can answer this as well, is you know, a lot of the conversation so far, I would say, about social housing has been focused on the role of the public sector, which is great. But you are an expert in the nonprofit sector. And there's a lot. We did have the nonprofit sector here represented today, but I think there hasn't been enough spoken about the role of the nonprofit sector. So, and for both Mike and for Rachel, as you think about this, as we think about new forms of social housing, how do we think about the relative roles of public, private, and nonprofit sectors?
We all work together. And I just want to give a quick shout out to Homeowners Rehab. The image on your invitation of Rivermark on Memorial Drive is a nonprofit homeowners rehab development, 300 units, I think it is, about 2/3 affordable, at below 80% of area median income. So there's an example of an incredible nonprofit organization doing wonderful work. And there are a number of people here from nonprofits that we've been hearing from. So I think the issue is, how do we work to leverage the best of both the nonprofit world with the public sector? And both of them are part of the social housing stock. I view them as the key components. CDC's, community development corporations, are the largest single owner of nonprofit housing. And then public housing is another critical, I think even now we still have about 1.5 million public housing units if you add in family public housing, elderly public housing, state public housing, and Department of Defense public housing. It's still 1.5 million units. And what? The White House. Oh boy, okay. Mike, your turn.
Well, no, I would agree with that. As I said earlier, I'm a big believer in yes and so in our legislation, our larger bill to advance social housing, we explicitly open the door to say that there can be collaboration with nonprofits, with community land trusts, certainly with quasi-government agencies. And so I think it's all about finding opportunities and figuring out how to leverage the robust institutional establishment of affordable housing development that we have in Massachusetts to be able to deploy social housing in this way. While we're giving shout outs, I also wanted to hold up the comprehensive housing plan for Massachusetts that Governor Healy put out earlier this year. It explicitly mentions and cites advancing social housing as a goal of the housing plan in the coming years. And so, this gathering, I think, just gives me hope that we can make this real.
That may be heading us, thank you, Mike. That may be the place to kind of bring us home. I think, as we plan this gathering, I think we're inspired by the conversation that's happening about social housing. I feel like there are periods in our history where we have a revolution in housing systems. We haven't had much of a change in a long time. I mean, arguably, I think 1986, the introduction of LIHTC was a major shift in our system. And sometimes I think the conversations about social housing get misinterpreted as a criticism of LIHTC. Look, there's lots about LIHTC we might want to change, but it's produced 3 million housing units that are incredibly important part of our affordable housing fabric. So this isn't necessarily an indictment of LIHTC, but it's also the sense that we got to have some other idea for what it is we can do to address our housing needs. And I think we're at that moment. And so I guess for Rachel, you've been doing this a long time. You opened up with your optimism. Mike, you're new to this. Like, is there reason to believe that this is that moment when we can actually conceive of something and bring to pass something new and better, in addition to what we're doing?
I think this could be the moment for thinking and for organizing and for working together on new ideas. I don't think this is necessarily the moment where we're going to see change and implementation of those ideas. But that means that we should be working and preparing. We should be looking more at mixed income housing. What do we really know about the outcomes of mixed income housing? What does that mean? What does it mean when we have foreign investors, taking up lots of buildings and units on both of the coasts? What does it mean to try to limit the vacation rentals by owner? How do we manage the rental housing stock? So I think there are a lot of questions that students and researchers can be working on as we're thinking about this moment as a time for thinking, reflecting, organizing, coming up with ideas, and hopefully being prepared and ready when the time is ripe for actually implementing them.
Sure, and I'd also add, we heard, in the panels that it's hard to deploy, funding at a large scale until you've proven it on the pilot scale. And I think to your point of, is this the moment, is it not the moment? It is a moment where we in Massachusetts have to do more because we know we can't count on the federal government. Things like tenant opportunity to purchase, those are policy decisions we can make that aren't going to add to the budget of the state at a time that the budget's constrained, so we can push that. And I think, the ultimate hope would be, let's demonstrate and prove some of these concepts now, and then hopefully when there's more favorable days in Washington, D.C., we can do what Massachusetts has always done, which is lead the way. I mean, we had the first rental voucher program statewide in Massachusetts. We've led the way on things like developing public housing on the state level in Massachusetts. So we can act now here in Massachusetts and hopefully scale up nationally.
Rachel?
Just adding to that, I just do want to point out exactly what Mike is saying. Massachusetts has been a leader, and we've developed, even back in the 70s, and we were developing the pieces of a support system for nonprofit and public and social housing. Massachusetts has had many of the components in place for decades to try to produce affordable housing. And I think what Mike is talking about and the initiatives that are going on currently really fuel that and add to that legacy that I think we all should be proud of. 40B program was a historic program, and it has worked. And I will just underscore that we have been, and we should be proud of what we've accomplished. And I think with leadership like from Mike and the governor, we're going to continue to push the agenda, push the limits of what's possible.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Kenzie, you said that earlier, the same thing about having pilots and testing. I think we are at a moment where there's enough pressure in the system, enough people involved, that there's support for innovation and trying of things. We have to expect that some things won't work, but we have to keep trying, and as you say, start to plant the seeds for things that can be brought to a bigger scale. Because I think what the recognition of this movement is that we're not doing things at either the scale or the scope of what we need. The scale meaning the number of people served, and the scope meaning who's served and the types of housing that are provided. And so I think allowing these 1,000 flowers to bloom, keeping the track of them, but I think we also have to, what we're trying to do in having this conversation is to say there's a lot of pieces of the social housing movement, and we all got to row together. Because I think too often in the housing world, we're all compartmentalized and kind of working our own fiefdom. So I think today, let's make a vow. Let's work together, let's think about big ideas, and let's take the long view. The other thing that today, I think Kenzie's point about that public housing in East Boston and Charlestown and South Boston, that is so important. The incrementalism has a bad word, but add, and don't subtract, and we'll get there. So I just wanted to say to everybody, keep the faith. Thank you for being here and staying for all this time. I want to thank Suzanne Schindler, who was a driving force behind this, David Luberoff, Zach Davidson, all the folks in the GSD who put on these shows, David Luberoff, James Chaknis, Carrie Donahue, all the people who made this happen. So, and of course, all the panelists and the moderators who gave all your time and energy to be here. So thank you all. And as a reward, there are beers and wines and snacks in the porticos at the end. So thank you all.